Similarly, in talking about tinok shenishma, the Chazon Ish writes elsewhere. You can find it on page 10 in your packets and chelik beis of Yoredea Simin Chav Ches. Right? He says that the entire idea of Morid V'Lo which Gemara talks about and stuff, is talking about during the times of Chazal when there was a Gila Shechina. When it was evident that there was such a thing as when you could mamish see the hashgacha in the world, right? But now, when it's not so clear, when it's not so obvious, none of this applies, right? As the Golos Mamis writes in Perik Vav of Hilchos Deos, right? Kosav de ein rishonim lisnoso ela achar she'ina makabel tocha, right? Since it's not so clear, right? You had to rebuke him, and then you could only hate him. Not necessarily Morim V'Lamala, but then you can only hate him until he rejects your tocha, right? And he says further, right? Instead, since now he says, he quotes B'Shem, it was so safer avas chesed kasa B'Shem agrimulin the mitzalel v'asar rishayim, right? We should love the rishayim, right? We should try to do whatever we could to be makari of them, right? And the Rav Kook writes similarly in Igros Ariyah, Simon and Kuf Yud Gimel, right? So the minim nowadays aren't the same minim of the times of Chazal, and you can't the same halachos of Morid V'Lo Malin. Of course, it doesn't apply. Right?
Similarly, Rav Ovadia Hodaya says in his Sefer Yaskil Avdi, he argues that against the Bion Tzion, saying that nowadays people are warned of Shabbos, and they're warned that warned of all the different halachos of Shabbos. Yet since they're ignoring them, we have to hold them accountable somewhat, and he doesn't agree with this concept that the Binyon Tzion that we can't hold them accountable at all. Also, Rav Simcha Chadasha says in Yoredei Chelek Beis that Shabbos and Avodah Zarah, in regards to those two mitzvot, no matter how good of a person he is, if he violates them, he's a dino kanachri. And the whole idea of the Chazon Ish was only referring to someone who violates minor averos. But for someone who violates Shabbos, even one time he's going to be considered a mumar al kol Torah kula. And this idea of the Binyon Tzion, he says,
to summarize what we were mentioning earlier, the Minchas Eluzur, the Minchad al-Azhar writes that, as we mentioned earlier, that he completely rejects the Yesod of the Binyan Tzion, says that it doesn't make sense. How could it be Mekadesh? How could it be a half Shomer Shabbat? Such a thing doesn't exist, and therefore you have to treat him like going mamish. The Yaskil Avdi, as we mentioned earlier as well, Rovadi Hedaya, he writes that such people, since back in the times of the Chazon Ish, there was no tochecha going on, so you could treat him like tinok shenishba. But nowadays you hear people saying Shabbos. So since people are giving them tochecha and they still reject it, they would have the status of going mamish as well. The Simcha Chadasha writes as well that a person who violates Shabbat and or Avodah Zarah has a special din to themselves. Since the chomer of the Isser is so severe, it's such a severe sin that they're doing, it would be different than all other averot, and therefore they would have a status of a goy, regardless of whether or not they know what they're doing was wrong or not. Now, to briefly elaborate, to bring a further posting that address the issue, the Ben Ish Chai writes in Rav Pe'alim in Or Chaim Chelek Bet Siman Yudchet that we cannot be astray from the words of Chazal Yaminu Small, and therefore, since Pashtut is throughout the Sugya and Chas, the Gabe Yain Nesech, the Gabe Avodah B'Mikdash, that if a person violates Shabbat publicly and or worships Avodah Zarah, he would have the status of a goy, and we cannot make compromises nowadays and say no, the times have changed and the case is different. The Ben Ish Chai says straight out, in such a case, they have a status of goy, and there is no turning back from the psak of Shas and Poskim. Similarly, Rabbi Tzal Stern, in his Tshuvot B'Tzelach Chochma, Chelek Hey Siman Ein Chet, writes that at first glance he wants to be matir. It seems as if that you could treat him like a tinok shenishba, and you could be lenient because they don't really know any better. However, towards the end of his Tshuvah, he makes a slight turn, not more than a slight turn, but he writes that Uma shehem hayu mechalei mota yadu shehu neged dat haTorah. And how nowadays these people, they know that what they're doing is wrong and that they're going against our religion and the rules of the Torah, right? El shehem rafu yedehem mikiyum haTorah v'hamitzvot. Rather, these people who are violating Shabbat, publicly, they're just doing it out of weakness towards keeping Torah and mitzvot. שניתו ליצרם והלכו אחר הבצע עד שניתפו גם לחלל את השבת. That they are, so to speak, being a little poetic over here, but the Yetzer Hara, so to speak, is seducing them and is getting the best of them, and therefore, yes, Enechinami, they're falling under the trap of the tremendous Yetzer Hara that surrounds them, but regardless, that's Ikar Milchama that a person has to go through to fight such a Yetzer Hara, and because of the fact that he's failing, we have to treat him like a goy, and there is no room to be makel. Last but not least, right, Acharon Chaviv, the Rav Wosner writes in Shut Shevet HaLevi, Chelek Chet Siman Kuf Samech He, he writes that we have to, the Ikar Yesod of everything is really based on how the child was raised, or the adult. Meaning, if the child was, if a person was raised in a home which stressed the kedusha and the importance and the very fact that you have to keep Shabbat, you can't worship Avodah Zarah, you can't do things like this. So if he goes off the derech, if he or she goes off the derech, and for whatever reason, decides to violate Shabbat openly, he would have the status of a goy, and we treat him like a goy l'chol ha'inyan. However, if he was raised in a home in which he had zero knowledge of such things, and yes, he might have heard some things in the streets, he might have heard people saying Shabbos, but no, writes the Shevet HaLevi that it's really it's really based on how the parents raised him and how the Ikar foundation of his sense of how Shabbat and Avodah Zarah works, that we treat him as a goy, as to whether, in regards to whether or not he violates Shabbat publicly.
I'm sorry, I didn't get to see this tshuva of the Ravaz inside, but the Ravaz says a crazy chiddush, right? He brings a raya from Sanhedrin, Daf Sadi Tes, right? The Gemara says that Chizkiyahu was right to be the Melech Mashiach, but he lost out because he didn't give proper praise. And then Rebbe Hillel, not Beis Hillel, but Rebbe Hillel says, after extensive research, that there's never going to be a Melech Mashiach. Says the Ravaz in a tshuva that if a person does extensive research into something, and he, as a result of this research, he proves against one of the Ikari Torah. For instance, he does extensive research on atheism, and he finds out, and he makes some logical, rational argument for atheism. After extensive research, he's considered an anus. Because how else could we say Rabbi Hillel, he's quoted in the Gemara. He's clearly not a min, he's clearly not a Bikoris. Yet he goes against one of the Ikari Muna. It must be, says the Ravaz, that if someone does extensive research on something and he makes a rational argument to say against one of the Ikari Muna, he's considered tinok shnishba, he's an anus, and so forth. However, what's very interesting is that the Ravaz does not mention the Chasam Sofer. The Chasam Sofer says that no, Rabbi Hillel he's a mumar. Very, very difficult Ravaz, but it's still a tremendous chiddush.